to do first in all of this is that we do have to recognize the significance the day after a significant event in our history. So I wanted Alethea to come on because, girl, you ain't going to be able to say nothing to them Jamaicans, them AKAs, and them Howard alum.
No, you can't. But as a proud Spelman alumna who is unapologetic, I believe in the HBCU family. And while I might not agree with her in policy.
Right. Well, that's what I said. I
will happily be casting my vote for a different choice.
So my thing is like, look, okay, so we all HBCU family. I'm a rattler all day long. So I'm like, all right, big ups. But I was teasing Alethea. Okay. Oh, so of course she got stuff in the chat now talking about ski-wee. So I'm gonna let y'all have it, okay? They gonna be like, well,
listen, I am not Greek officially, but I grew up in a Greek home. My father was the alpha, and the AKAs were my aunties and my mamas and so I have deep allegiance. So
I got a rattler on. Hey.
Yes, come on, fam, you. So I believe in it. It's important. It matters. And somebody posted, I think it might have been on Dr. Tamara Lomax's page, a picture of her when she crossed Alpha chapter at Howard.
Oh.
And what it takes, like my father crossed by himself Alpha in 1979. Like what our folks were doing for initiation, right? As we get into this conversation, because that's really why it was so poignant. It's because it was initiation.
It was.
And it matters. That's why it's so pervasive now. That's why it has the staying power that it has, is because it was initiation.
Right.
So,
wait, I'm turning myself up. Go ahead.
I'm all for it.
Okay. So I'm going to start by just kind of telling people a little bit about you. So I was reading over your bio again because I like to, instead of reading, kind of point out the things that are significant to me. Okay. So this is I coined this new term last week, my sister colleague. This is Estee Nena Dillard. You got to say the Nena.
You have to say the Nena.
Her ancestors are going to know that you calling her, because that's the name that they're going to call her. So this is my sister's dad, has graduated with a bachelor's degree from Spelman. Then she went on to get her MDiv at Camden School of Theology up there at Emory. So she done had this balanced world of being at the HBCUs that ground you, and then going up there in those other spaces.
Absolutely.
And, making it do what it do. She is a licensed minister. She was licensed at Rise Community Church, which, big up to if anybody's on that is part of the Rise community. And I love this about her because she describes herself as a womanist. So, of course, I'm going to love that. And
unapologetic.
And was it queer sexologist?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
I love that term. A queer sexologist.
Yes.
She's a minister. And she's also initiated to Ifa and Olokun. So you done covered all the bases. And a Black woman from the South. So I'm just loving all them pieces about you.
Listen, and the Black woman from the South is a big deal too. Like that. Like I have a. I'm gonna use your term, a sister colleague. About me. I see my ears in the chat.
Hey.
I have a sister colleague who we talk about how we're going to have to at some point do some writing because really, particularly being a Black woman from the South, from a womanist lens, that Black church for Black women in the South, as a queer woman, it's a very particular experience that I think is a seat of a lot of power, but it also requires a particular conversation. So, yeah.
So help me understand this. How did a Black woman, you grew up in the church, right?
Very much so.
Every Sunday?
Like, I was the kid that I spent more time at church than I did at school. Like, literally. My father was always in leadership in church. So my whole life, before me, my father was always in leadership. So he was a deacon. Before he was ordained as a deacon, he was, over the Sunday school. He was over the church choir that he grew up in. So he was always a leader in church. And my mother was the child of parents who were church leaders. So my mother very easily acquiesced into being the wife of a church leader. She always kind of secretly hoped my father would be a preacher. And so they were super active, and we joined when I was 5. We joined a church that they became fast leaders in as a part of like a couple group. So it was like those sets of couples. It was probably like 6 couples primarily that ran the church, including the pastor and his wife. And they all became really close. And so I literally would be at church 5 or 6 days a week in the evenings. And then on Saturdays, you got to go to choir rehearsal. You got to go to the youth usher board meeting. You got to go to then I helped bring the Girl Scouts to the church. So, and then I became the president of the Girl Scouts on the junior league, so I was very deeply entrenched in the church my entire life.
You grew up in the church. So help me understand this. How did a Black woman that grew up in rural Georgia, in Macon, Georgia, that grew up in the church, how in the world did you get to being initiated to Ifa no Lokun? And we're going to define those terms in a second. How did that happen?
I had a praying grandmama.
That's all you need. Like, that's good. That's all you need right there.
I had praying grandmothers, I should say. I had praying grandmothers. I think that it really, really is. I know that it's an ancestral call. My folks were deeply faithful folks. And I think their faithfulness in being spiritual was far more important to them than the religiosity of it. But the religiosity was the part that held us accountable. So while we were very tied to a lot of those religious tropes and behaviors and commitments, and my family still is. My family is very Christian. They think I'm very strange. They like Nena on that weird stuff, but we love her anyway.
I can understand that.
But I really believe that it was my ancestral connection that called me into a different level of work with African spirituality. And it's in my name. I'm named after my grandmother. That's why you have to call me Nena, because Nena is my great grandmother's name. It's even spelled with an E and not an I, because she was born a slave and she spelled it with an E because that was how it sounded. So, Estee comes from Ethel and Essie, who were my dad's mother, and his godmother, who adopted him. Really, she wasn't an official godmother. He was support for that, but she adopted him and taught him how to be an educator and helped him conceptualize going to college. So, I have this name that called me into being. My father named me and wanted a girl before he had a wife and a fiance.
I love that.
So even for me, I know that itself was a special particular call of my spirit into this realm at this time for this experience. And so I was thinking about this earlier, because I'm like, how do I prepare for this? There's no way to prepare. But but that's me. So the part of me that likes order and balance is like, how do I prepare? And I was remembering, as a child, I've always been a spiritualist. I was a child who studied the deacons. So my mother tells this story about how I was like 2 or 3 years old. And all of a sudden in church, I was like, I want to lead the prayer, which is like, first of all, you're not a man. Second of all, women don't preach here. Like, I'm sorry, what is this child? But because I was a baby, they obliged. And I mimicked, and with energy and with power, did exactly what the deacons did. And my parents were like, we don't know where she got that from. But it was because as a spiritualist, I had studied those that were invoking the spirits, because in the Baptist church, and if I have a witness here, the Baptist church, you have the deacons come in before you start service. They set the tone. They start praying. They start, which we see all this in African traditions, which we can get to later. But they invoke the spirit first. They line hymns, so they sing, right? And the deacons do all this kind of invitational work for the spirit, and I naturally was always the child that gravitated to that and thrived in it, right? And so I think because of the healing work that happens there, because of the power that happens there, I just kept getting called deeper and deeper into it. So actually, my connection to African spirituality came from going to seminary. I took a class with Dr. Emmanuel Lartey,
Hey, Dr. Lartey, yep.
who is one of the most magnificent people walking the face of this earth.
Oh, he's a good.
That's an incredible man that I love very much. And he taught African spirituality and healing. And I remember a diviner coming in the room and being frightened and feeling like, I feel drawn to this, but everything is telling me that ain't the Lord.
I don't know about that.
I'm going to sit in the corner. I'm not touching nothing, right? And I'm just going to sit here and let her talk because, you know, I plead the blood of Jesus first. But being in that Christian context, I think for me, as a person who's also an academic, it allowed me to be in conversation with African spirituality before I practiced it. So that also was a major bridge, but it's my ancestors. It's my, now, you know, my father, one of my primary ancestors who is on the other side, who calls me into faithfulness for Black people. You know, my father was a huge advocate for children. He was an educator. He was well known, a great man of character. And that was because he was committed to Black people. And his way of doing that work was with Black children. So even my dad's mantra that people would talk about as a principal, his question was always, are the children well? Which is an African proverb, right? But he wasn't thinking about it like that, right? So it's all of these kinds of retentions that we have and that we hold and that we talk about and that govern how we are functioning in community, how we are doing the work of being with one another in faithful settings and spiritual settings and religious settings, but it's not always named that way. So my journey was to be able to name it and to be able to demonstrate and manifest leadership in both areas.
Okay. So now tell us about, so you're initiated to Olokun and to Ifa. So people that don't know what those terms are, then tell us what that is.
Oh, sure. This excites me. So, so I am initiated in the West African Orisha tradition, which is, I don't know who Dillard Boy 01 is, but I'm gonna say that's my cousin. So hey, cuz, welcome. It ain't but so many Dillards. So even if you're a Dillard from the West Coast, we family, we cousins. But yeah, I'm initiated in the West African Orisha tradition, and I was trained there and initiated in West Africa, Nigeria, in Oshobo, which is my lineage. So what that means is I have been connected to the eldership of these Orisha energies, which are nature deities that come out of Yoruba lands. And this is a tradition that we see in the Americas as well, that came through the transatlantic slave trade, but they're different lineages. So on this side of the water, we hear about it from Lukumi most often in the African American context. So Ifa Orumala is our great diviner, is our great communicator, Orisha, who is the elder, who comes with the energy of elevation. Most often you see Ifa devotees being men, but in my tradition, women are initiated as well, and that was the first Orisha that called me to the mat, so to speak, which is to initiation. And Olokun in my tradition is the ocean. So Olokun is both male and female. It is a gender fluid. So I call it the womanist Orisha. Now that's my own tagline. But literally she is the king of the water. Is how the Odus talk about Olokun and the energy that we know to be the ocean. So the way the water flows and how it is so vast and cannot be captured, but it's also the same place where you can go to get your healing, or if you sink to the bottom, it will crush you. So Olokun and Ifa are are the official initiations that I have. I also walk very closely with ancestral energy and work as an ancestral conduit in general, as well as in the Ifa tradition.
So what is an ancestral conduit? You got to break these things down. What does that mean?
So really, it's and the ability to function as a medium, but I choose the word conduit intentionally because for myself as a practitioner, for myself as a spiritual leader, it is more than just the ability to hear, feel, sense, know the presence of the ancestors and communicate that. It's also, I say conduit because for me, I also am a person who does healing work, who does spiritual consultation and coaching for people through this connection with their ancestors as spiritual guides for them to be able to elevate and heal their own lives. So that's more than just being able to get a message from the spirit realm.
Okay. So part of it is being able to receive that message from the spirit realm and give that message to someone. But then the other part is to be able to do the healing work too.
Yes.
So question, what's the difference between someone that is a conduit and someone that just come up to you after church and say, you know, the Lord just put something on my heart, and really it ain't the Lord put nothing on their heart. They just being messy. I was just saying that way.
No, really, it's true. The church mothers would say you have to try the spirit by the spirit. So somebody in here who real churchy will get it. But you have to try the spirit by the spirit. So the first thing is, in any spiritual work, you have to be doing your own work for your own connection.
Ashe.
Number one. So in the West African Orisha tradition, we would call that or rework. We would call it having the clarity to have your own spiritual head, your own spiritual destiny aligned in a healthy way with your thoughts and with your clarity. So if somebody comes up and says something to you that's messy and out of alignment, you should have the discernment to be able to know first.
Oh.
And that can happen in any tradition, right?
Anywhere you go.
And I think the other thing, I think it's two parts too, because the other part is the person could have a word from the Lord, but if their character is not correct, how that gets delivered, how that gets shared, where it gets shared, in what ways it gets shared, what gets read, what gets intuited, that also is a part of the being a conduit. So for me, as a leader, as a person who is training and will always be training, as a person who is responsible for other people's spirit and their spiritual growth, it's my responsibility that as a conduit, my character always precedes my gift, which is a life work. But yeah, if somebody come up and say something messy to you, you should know it. And there's a difference in the way that it should resonate for a person when it's truth and it's coming from spirit and truth versus it's foolishness.
Got it. Okay, so let's jump in because I'm sure that people want to hear. And let me create a context for this. So you already know this about me, that I was not raised Christian. I was raised in California. I say where everybody going to hell. So that's the joke that I made because I didn't know anybody that went to church growing up. That just wasn't what we did. And so,
oh yeah, no, absolutely, y'all going to hell, yeah, for sure. yeah.
And we came, so I moved to the South and like everybody go to church. I was like, oh, this is interesting. And so the way that I move through the world now as an Ifa and Oshun and a Egungun initiate is very different than people that grew up in the church. So some things that people struggle with, I don't struggle with because I never had that experience. So I really want to speak to the folks that have been raised Christian or are still going to church, but they feel like you said when the diviner came into the room, you feel drawn to African spirituality, but then may have gotten some messages that it's evil and wrong. Talk to people about that. Like, how did you work through that for yourself?
Oh, that's a big question. It's been a journey. It's been a journey, and I feel like we can often say that, and it sounds cliche or it sounds surface, but it really has been a journey. I think where it started for me, though, quite honestly, is I was raised in a Baptist church where women couldn't preach. Women could speak, and we could speak from the floor, and you were invited to your seat, right? Where you could touch the sacred elements. So the deaconess were responsible for all of the sacraments, but they could not administer the sacraments. Women could not be deacons in the church. Women could not be ministers in the church. And I remember for a very long time, there was no even talk about it because it was so much of an abomination, like so many other things, that it just wasn't even up for discussion. And when I was about 11 or 12, one of these same couples that I talked about earlier that were the leaders in my church, the wife of one of those deacons started saying that she was called to ministry. And so then those couples in power in my church had to struggle with, now one of our inside folks is saying something that is absolutely outside of what we would permit in our tradition. And I think my ability to wrestle theologically began with that conversation, because I had to watch my father refuse to go to her ordination, which was a big deal. And my mother refused not to attend her sister friend's ordination, which my parents being in disagreement is a big deal, because we're talking about folks who are by the letter of what they understand the Bible to be communicating, right? So in my house, what my daddy said was law, period. And my pastor put that minister through, Minister Mabel Randall, I call her name, she's still alive. My pastor has since transitioned, but put her through like a 7 or 8 year process. Much more deliberate than I had ever seen him be with any man, because he himself had to struggle with, how do I shape myself as a pastor when my friend is saying, and I'm trying the spirit by the spirit when we talk about discernment, and I believe and I see the fruit of her walking with God in a particular way, but everything that I know tells me that women can't preach. And so having to, as a child, watch my elders navigate that struggle for me is when I remember, and some of it is just my nature too. Like, I have to own that, because I was always a child that my mom said I used to embarrass her at church, because I would be like, well, why we got to do it this way? That doesn't make any sense to me. Right. You know, it's the same thing. Like, I remember being a teenager and, you know, one of the girls getting pregnant and having to come to apologize to a church, which is a whole nother live for a whole nother conversation, which is, we can have a whole nother conversation about sexuality, right? But she had to apologize. And I remember walking out and being like, they got her on the front pew apologizing, and the boy is here sitting in the back. I don't understand, right? So, So some of it is my nature, but having to wrestle theologically, in ways that I didn't recognize that I was doing it, really caused me to have to sit with these large doctrinal ideas that ultimately led me to be willing to ask questions that I probably wouldn't have asked if I hadn't have had to wrestle that way when I was a child. So ultimately, fast forward to graduate school. And I would really say it was the efficacy of it, because I'm also a ritualist, and that's something that I didn't know I was doing. So this is where I got to call out my own elder, Dr. Ifetayo Toure, who has changed and blessed my entire life. But I sit at her feet because she was for many reasons, but among them, she was the first person to come to me when, you know, as a person who's a spiritualist, I was having lots of kinds of experiences, some of good vibration, some of not, because that's part of the process too. And her coming to me and stopping me and saying, baby, you're a ritualist. You don't know that you're pouring this dirt over here by this tree for a reason, but you're doing that for a reason. And so having people, having elders that were able to point me in directions was helpful. But I really had to go through the journey of asking the question of, what does my relationship with the Creator look like? Where's the place where I feel most connected? What are the ways that I see the results, the impact, the work of spirit in my life? And for me, that was absolutely connected to my ancestors. And my ancestors' traditions were African. Even if I go so far back, or just to go as far back as my grandmother, right? My grandmother had superstitions, is what we call them, about sweeping people's feet, or traditions that you had to do on New Year's that she was adamant about, that she was unapologetic about. If it started storming, my grandmother was going to unplug everything in that house but the refrigerator. Ethel Ashe. And you're going to sit in this dark and we're going to listen for God. And for me, particularly as a child of Shango and Olokun, storms have a spiritual impact on me. So that was always a time that I treasured, but I didn't understand until I had access to the information that there was a reason I was having an experience in those times. There was a reason why now I know when it's storming, I'm going to quiet myself because it's time for me to connect. But my grandmother knew that it was a time to give reverence. Well, where did that come from? How did she have that knowing, right? You know, if we're going to be academic about it, that's for me an embodied epistemology. There was a way that in her body, she had a way of knowing that there's power here to sit with, to honor, to revere, that ain't got nothing to do with something that we learned at church on Sunday. And it's not in opposition to that. It was always alongside it because it was a part of her practice. It was a part of her rituals. And so for me, being able to process through those experiences, I really recognized that I had already been embodying these ways of being that were African and ancestral. So to be willing to name them and do the spiritual work of connecting to the tradition for me as a spiritualist was just the obvious next step.
So what would you say? I think I got two questions. So remind me, I want to ask a kind of like a biblical question, but I want to first start with people that would listen to you and say that what you were doing is against God, it is not Christian, and that it is a sign that you're going to hell. How would you respond to them?
Well, first I'm gonna go out on a limb and say, I don't believe in hell. I mean, I just, even if it's just one person here that ever watches this, baby, hell is to be here and be inauthentic.
Or living right now in the United States the way things are right now.
And not have community, and not have love, and not know joy, and not have peace.
Yeah.
So please don't live in hell and think you dying and going to hell. So let's just, so we can throw, that's my answer to hell, period. Yeah, that's yeah.
Quick, fast, and in a hurry.
Yeah, so that's hell.
Okay.
Well, and I think the other thing is, we have to be willing to be in conversation with each other, but we also have to know what fights are not our fights. A person who thinks that I'm absolutely not of God, who has known me and spent time with me, then God bless you. I'm not invested in an argument, because I'm clear about who I am and I'm unapologetic about that. But again, for the people who are struggling and trying to make sense of it, I think what I would say is we have to understand that the Christianity that we were given is not without context, is not without agenda, is not without other larger themes like white supremacy. Right. and
misogyny.
And right, and so that doesn't mean that we need to throw it away, which is why I'm absolutely, you ain't gonna never get me to not be Christian. But I do think there's an interrogation that we have to be willing to do about how we understand our Christianity and how we understand our connection to God alongside those other things that were embedded in focusing on a Christianity that came to us in a certain way. So is it not of God? I think you have to be willing to ask the question, what does your spirit say? because that's the other thing. And when I'm working with clients or when I'm working with groups, this is the thing that I often say is most people won't religiously align the way that I do, and that's not even my desire. I don't expect for folks to try to function in multiple traditions, because actually a great deal of work that brings me a great deal of joy because it's who I am. But I don't think that's the point. I think the point is to see that there is more connection than there is difference. And if your spirit is calling you to the places where there's overlap and where there's intersection, honor that your spirit is looking to do a work in your own life, for your own destiny, for your own path, that is calling you to that place for an intention, for a purpose, for such a time as this for you. Mm-hmm. And if that is happening, and if you're feeling that, then we know that's God.
All right. Ashe. All right. So that's interesting, because someone asked me that question last week, like what do you say? How do you respond to people who say it's devil worship or anything like that? I was like, I don't even get in those conversations with people. If they think that, all right, fine, whatever. I'll keep it pushing. And for me, one of the things that I think about is my brothers and sisters that I know that are Christians, that are a good heart. And I know that they are good people, and they are attempting to walk a path that is in divine alignment with the teachings of Jesus Christ. I can appreciate that. What I know is those people that call themselves Christian and were engaged in the transatlantic trade in human beings and decided that they were going to build churches and kidnap people and rape women and put people in the bottom of the ship and murder those folks and put them in ships that were called Jesus Christ and the Mary and all these Christian terms, those people wasn't Christian.
Right. And that wasn't Jesus. That ain't Jesus.
That ain't
That's
Jesus.
Not my Jesus.
I'm like, okay, and I will always say, I am not a biblical scholar, but the last time that I looked, Jesus wasn't going and snatching up folks.
No.
And selling them and raping women.
And I think the other thing that I just have to name in this moment is Jesus was a black man, right? We're talking about
a revolutionary black man that was fighting African against oppressors.
Revolutionary. And I also don't want to move too quickly past why that's a struggle for folks. Like I'll give a personal example. I've been cleaning out my childhood home to switch it into an investment property. So I'm going through a lot of my father's things. And my daddy was very intentionally committed to black folks and unapologetic about, and I don't know that he had all the theological stuff worked out for sure, but he was like, Jesus, the black man, we had black dreaded Jesus and all this kind of stuff, right? But then I found all these Lord's Supper plates from the church with white Jesus on it. And I'm like, of all these things that I'm struggling with, of like, do I throw it away? I'm like, white Jesus going in the trash. I'm not keeping white, like, I'm not even letting somebody take white Jesus out this house. White Jesus around me gonna have to die. Right. I don't honor white Jesus. But the struggle of it is real, because there is a way that we have internalized and come to understand some efficacy of this empire Christianity, of the Christianity that we were given. And while those other tropes are there, because they have not been named for generations, it's a very real thing to be willing to navigate. So I'm not unwilling to name that or work through that. But what I'm saying is, when your spirit is calling you to something different, then that's where you have to be willing to say, how do I wrestle with what my question actually is? And most often, what I experience is people just want to know that God's going to be okay with them.
Ashe.
Which was my question too, right? Which is why I'm saying my struggle started with Minister Mabel Randall trying to say that she could preach, because I couldn't be a black preacher first before I'm a priest, before I'm a spiritualist, before I'm a ritualist. I could not do all of these things if I had not first wrestled with my own calling to preach and what it meant for me to stand in a pulpit when my grandmother had to speak from the floor. Right.
Wow.
And so the intensity of having to unlearn Christianity in that way is a very, very real experience, and it's doable. it's that part that I'm inviting people to be honest about, is how do you ask the question of of yourself? Where is the place where I'm not sure God and my grandmama gonna be all right with me doing this a different way?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that, wow, that's really powerful. I want to pay attention to our time. We got folks on here, so if y'all got questions for my sister, then put them in the chat so I can see them. Pull this out in terms of Bible verses. You know, I told you I don't know. I can't go to no Bible verses. So what does the Bible
I might need help. We'll see.
What does the Bible say in terms of the idea of connecting, honoring, remembering your ancestors?
Oh, you know, so that's a loaded question, because I think that there are things that the Bible says, and I think that there are things that we have been taught to read the Bible to say. So one of the first things I learned in seminary is, you know, folks feel like they've read the Bible, but you've been taught to read it in a particular way. So I often think about, you know, the scripture where it talks about letting the bed bury the dead, right? And the way that we were taught to read that is that once a person is dead, you let the folks in that realm handle it. You don't touch it to obstruct the veil between those two realms is to be doing work that's not of light and of God, right? But that's the way we were taught to read that. And so I think that's the other part that makes Bible questions tricky, which is why that's why I'm like, sometimes I'm willing to have a Bible conversation and sometimes I'm not, because, you know, because if you go into it approaching it without a certain level of openness, then you're going to continue to see what you've always been taught to see. Gotcha. The scripture that we most often go to when we talk about ancestors, that's kind of the obvious one, is in Hebrews, where it talks about being surrounded by a great cloud of witnesses, which I don't know what that is other than
the ancestors,
your personal army of your folks, right?
Sounds good to me.
That we all come with. So I mean, I certainly have preached that text. I certainly point to that text. I certainly think that that's a very valuable text to use. In fact, I preached that text in a different way for my grandfather's eulogy, because you also got to know your audience. And in Sunflower, Alabama, several people was like, I think you might have changed my mind that women can preach at all. So I was like, let me just stay there. We're not doing ancestors today. So I did a ritual when they left. I say, but other than that text, I think there are several others. But the most obvious one that I often point to is there's all kinds of genealogy in the Bible, just all kinds of genealogy.
You can start it.
That is, I'm sorry, that is from Genesis through the New Testament. And part of why Jesus is Jesus, which is why this is where I kind of want to rest my hat on answering your question. Part of why Jesus is Jesus is because Jesus is of the lineage of David. Part of why Jesus is seen as this messianic figure who we know has a particular connection as the Son of God is because of his lineage. So in the beginning of the New Testament, and I'm talking about, there's all kinds of genealogy in the Bible. I mean, chapters. I remember, you know, the first time I really tried to read the Bible, I was probably like in the 6th grade. Because I grew up in Catholic schools and we had to do catechism. And I remember struggling through the Old Testament because I'm like, they say begat one more time, you know, and it's all of these Hebrew and ancient African, ancient Near Eastern names. And
I stopped.
Yeah,
I couldn't do it.
And it's like, I don't, you know what I mean? Like, we on the 3rd chapter of begats, and I still don't know who we going to. Like, I don't know who's at the end. I just, you know, I just remember being very discouraged because I was like, you know, and that's what I was real saying, for real. You know, I was winning the Bible bowls. I was like, but I can't read these begats. I don't have it. So there's all kinds of genealogy in the Bible, but they talk about and name at the beginning of the New Testament, which focuses on the story of Jesus, which tells Jesus's birth story, which is how we get our Christmas narratives, right?
Mm-hmm.
Up to Jesus's death and resurrection and the ministry of Jesus. That's what the New Testament is ultimately about. But in the Synoptic Gospels, and we say it's Synoptic Gospels because they tell the synopsis of Jesus's story, which is Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the first 4 books of the New Testament. They began by explaining the New Testament, Jesus' genealogy. So you come all the way down from David, who was a king, right, to demonstrate and to make it clear that Jesus is already of this royal lineage, of this priestly lineage, right? Which means something if we're gonna get into all of that, because you got the different tribes, but this lineage is important. So you have to know why Mary is Jesus's mother, and you have to know why Joseph is Jesus's father. And even with, you know, the stories about Jesus's birth, right? Even the connection of Mary to Elizabeth and John, who precedes Jesus, who is Jesus's first cousin, right? So all of this contextualization that frames Jesus and sets him up to be who he is ancestral. It's ancestral. And so I think if there's anything that I try to communicate to folks who are struggling with that part of it, of how do I know who to call on and how do I know if it's okay, I point to that more so to say that the truth is all of our lineages matter. The ancestors of who begat your grandmama, that begat your great grandmama, that married your great great granddaddy, that chose to leave the plantation to have a child with somebody on a different plantation that they never saw again, that became your great 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 grandmother, is the reason your spirit was called into this body at this time for this lineage.
Oh, I love that. That's dope. I saw a question here, and so if other people have questions, definitely put them in and I will ask. So the question was that this person didn't see the beginning. The question was, what seminary did you attend? And so, I mean, you can answer that question.
Oh, sure. Yeah. So my graduate degree is from Emory University. I have a Master's of Divinity from Candler School of Theology.
And so let's go there for a little bit. Okay. I mean, I've been up there a couple of times and talking to the seminary students, and so that's been an interesting process of talking to the students. Yeah. So I think a lot of times people can be really impressed when you go to these elite European schools like Emory University. I wonder how those experiences, though, prepare you to do the work of serving our people. I'll leave it broad like
that. I think that what prepared me most from being at Emory was not about Emory at all. But it's about the Black women that came through Emory, and the womanist scholarship that has come out of Emory. And so I went to Emory because I was at Spelman struggling theologically, because I knew I was called to ministry, but I had no idea what to do with that. Like, absolutely no idea what to do with that. And at the time that I was a Spelman student, Reverend Dr. Lisa Rhodes was the dean of the chapel, and Reverend Dr. Melva Sampson was the program coordinator there. And so spending time around women who had gone to seminary and they had both been to Candler is what even introduced me to the idea. And so I could call a litany of women, but I'm gonna always call my spiritual mother, Reverend Dr. Maisha Handy, who is the provost of ITC, who is a Candler graduate and also one of the first Black women in her program to complete the PhD in religion at Emory. So the Wealth of Womanist scholarship that came out of Emory is the reason that I went there. And, you know, I'm unapologetically Black. And Emory is not.
We said it. She said it. It's here.
Yeah. So it was very challenging in that way. But what I will say is there was, and I credit Shonda for this, who was the director of admissions at Canada, who's now Shonda Jones, who's now at it's escaping me, Wake Forest. But when I came in at Emory, they had kind of recruited this rogue group of people, and most of them were Black folks, like not even people of color, like were Black folks, and queer folks, and we were in there wrestling and asking all kinds of questions. And so I could call a litany of those names also. So I think that it wasn't just the women that called me to the table at Emory, but it was also my colleagues that sat at the table with me, who pressed me through thinking about my community. Because shout out to Wake Forest. Because I think for me too, that was a huge part of my own development, because I always was drawn to work around sexuality. I was always unapologetically Black, even though I didn't understand what that meant quite yet about the African and ancestral and other African spiritual pieces. And so, you know, I would just be asking questions and saying stuff to be provocative, because that was how it came out of my mouth. And, you know, talking like I'm from Macon, Georgia, which is not like this. You know, and so having colleagues to be in conversation with you to say, now, Estee, you know you can't go in the church and the church mother hear you like that. Now, you're going to have to say that differently. Which then led me to ITC. You know, I, of course, because I have elders there, Dr. Teray and Dr. Handy, but, you know, I built other elders there and built community there. And so being in conversation with my colleagues at the table is what then kind of caused me to create this community. But what I will say that I am very grateful for, I actually had a very challenging time in graduate school. I was thinking about that earlier today for separate reasons, but is the access that I got being at a Research One institution in that way.
That's real. That's real.
It was an advantage. Like I think about my sister friend Trisha Hersey Patrick, who has started the NAP ministry, who a lot of that stuff for her got birthed working in the archives. And I remember just going to visit her in the archives, and she will be reading Lucille Clifton's original works, right? And it's a Thursday, and we're supposed to be writing papers, and we're sleep deprived in the archives.
Wow.
So I think it's outside of the community, outside of the relationships, outside of the network, that called me into deeper commitment to Black people. The access to the resources, to the primary sources, to the research access. Because I also originally went there to get a degree in public health, because I thought I was going to be a behavioral scientist. Doing work around sexuality before, because I was like, because I was wrestling, I was like, I'm gonna just teach people that they can be sexual and go to church, and I'm gonna just tell them about the way that you can do it spiritually, you know, in like a teaching educational setting, you know, because I didn't want to get nobody's pulpit.
So let me ask you this. So we got probably 10 more minutes or so before this thing, because it automatically shuts us off. So talk to us about like your big influences in terms of scholarly influences. I'm wondering, or theologians that may have influenced you. I'm wondering the influence of Dr. Katie Cannon on your work, the influence of Dr. Reverend Jeremiah Wright. I mean, there's so many people that we would talk about. I'm really interested, though, in Dr. Katie Cannon's work and how that's influenced who you have become as this womanist theologian and Ifa practitioner.
So this is where I love the spirit and I love our ancestors, because you absolutely don't know this, but Katie Cannon taught me.
Oh. Okay, wait a minute. Okay, before you even answer, that wasn't even planned. It was like, ask her about Katie Cannon, and like it was very clear. Like I kept very clear. So okay, so she's saying hi. So we know it's the ancestor showing up and saying hi. So
no, really. Dr. Cannon was the most transformative professor I had in seminary. Single most. Wow. And it was a short class, actually, because it was an accelerated class, because she was a professor at Union Presbyterian Seminary, so she was visiting. And that's not, I don't want to discount, I got to call names like Reverend Teresa Fry Brown and Dr. Emmanuel Larte. And I'm not at all not speaking to the transformative work of those other professors. But Dr. Cannon was absolutely the person for me who gave me the authentic knowing that who I was as a womanist scholar was not to be second guessed or apologized for.
All right.
So Dr. Cannon actually taught, the class that I took from Dr. Cannon was Code of Ethics and Freedom Narratives. So we studied slave narratives and used the primary sources of slave narratives to adapt them into preaching models, writing models, and to use them as a womanist lens. But she taught it almost like, I've experienced it more in the doctoral classes that I've taken, where she taught it from a perspective of, you go do your own work with this lens, and then let's be an academic conversation about it as colleagues. And every time she started class, she would say to us, if you are not doing the work of having your own personal devotion time, then you're not doing the work of being a student. And her other tagline that I think is more popular is, you have to be doing the work that your soul must have.
We got less than 2 minutes.
So Dr. Cannon, for me, was extremely pivotal academically, because I had struggled so much academically with what was happening in my life in graduate school. Dr. Cannon, I remember, read my first paper and made me come sit in front of her and was like, baby, you need a PhD. I don't care what you do, but what you must do is get a PhD. But so it was the womanist ethic. She was integrated. She was clear about her faithfulness to God. She was clear about her connection to her people. She was clear about her connection to the land. She could talk about North Carolina and where she was from. And she was very clear about why her people were in that city and where they had been slaves. And she was clear about this womanist work and what it meant to be the first woman ordained in the Presbyterian denomination, and how that was important to be able to shape who she was as a scholar and as a professor in relationship to other womanists, as well as the womanists coming behind her. And
Estee, I gotta stop you right there. So, because it's gonna literally shut off.
It's gonna shut us off. So
20 seconds to tell everybody how they can get in contact with you, particularly those people that may be struggling around these concepts and are interested in consultation, because you do consultation around this, right?
I do. I absolutely do.
Okay.
And I'm actually, yes, I'm happy to be in conversation with folks. I work with people, institution groups. I
give them your contact information.
Spiritualist. So, yes. So Instagram.